Hello, I'm Richard Moore. I'm with Daniel Friebe.
Hi, Richard.
And Ned Boulting.
Hello, Richard.
Welcome back, Ned.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to have you on here.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Interviews and analysis, we've got the big talking points covered.
We're going to be talking about the World Championships. We've just watched Sir Bradley Wiggins win his first world title on the road. He won quite convincingly from Tony Martin. And Daniel, you're back from your travels in Spain at the Vuelta a España. You brought us a very interesting little dispatch from the Vuelta last week, lots of interviews. Very good. Good work, Daniel.
Thank you.
What's you supposed to say to that?
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But the links between the interviews, were they recorded in a library or a quiet carriage on a train or something?
In my hotel room, mainly, in Santiago de Compostela, I think. Yeah.
But you also
People said I sounded ill. I wasn't ill.
No. You did sound a bit ill. You were also came back, I think, via the location for the World Championships. So you've done a bit of a recce of the road race course.
Yeah, Ponferrada. I mean, it's been described by Philippe Bouvet in L'Equipe today as mosh is the word he uses, which translates into English as pretty grim. The grimmest World Championship circuit pretty much in living memory in terms of the sort of decor, the scenery, and also just...
Any towns in Great Britain that remind you of?
Well, I was born in Coventry, so I wouldn't want to be derogatory about Coventry, but yeah, I said it reminded me a bit of Charleroi, if anyone has been there in Belgium. I'll leave it at that. It's not really a compliment.
If you go by Ryanair, isn't it?
But actually, that's to do a bit of a disservice Ponferrada, because it is surrounded by sort of beautiful mountains, and there is a very nice, I think it's medieval castle.
Quite different Florence last year, though, wasn't it? And that was quite a contrast. Sadly, we're not in Ponferrada. None of us are at the World Championships. We're in a pub in London. I mean, there is an argument. We were talking about this earlier, Daniel, for having the World Championships in a quite a small town like this, because Florence was beautiful, obviously, but there are challenges with when the World Championships are in a big city like that.
Well, it tends to cost too much money, and also it gets sort of swallowed up by other things that happen in Florence. I mean, the last few Italian World Championships have been notorious for how much money they've costed, and a lot of money disappearing into various black holes. That was the case with Florence. Well, there was certainly a lot of speculation before the Florence Worlds about it having costed 40 million, 90 million, over 100 million, and purely on resurfacing the roads, reorganising things. The Ponferrada one is a bit of a strange one. There was a lot of doubt about whether it would even go ahead for a long time, because the financial crisis in Spain has really bitten the last couple of years. But from everyone who's there said that certainly the town has really got into the spirit of things. Cancellara said in the press today that he wasn't particularly impressed with it. The ambience.
The chief commissar.
He said that it wasn't. He was finding it quite hard to get motivated, because it was nothing like Florence last year. The atmosphere in the town and just the general feel of the World Championship week.
I'm looking forward to Richmond next year in the States. I think that'll be a nice World Championship. Definitely will be there. Ned, we've just watched Bradley Wiggins win the time trial, as I mentioned. Quite convincingly, he really hammered Tony Martin. Though he did beat Tony Martin quite convincingly also at the Olympic time trial, of course, but otherwise Tony Martin has been dominant in time trials generally. You surprised? You saw him at the Tour of Britain, obviously, but you surprised by his performance there?
I can't say I'm surprised, but I do wonder whether Tony Martin's heavy racing programme has perhaps cost him if this was his big target, whether that was totally advisable to do the Tour de France and then the Vuelta. Wiggins has ridden the Tour of California very successfully, and then it's been pretty much feet up until the Tour of Britain, which, don't get me wrong, is a hard race, but it's not a grand tour. And perhaps that cost him, ultimately the nature of the circuit or the course didn't look particularly, suited Bradley. I think he went on record, didn't he, before the race, and saying, this one's perfect for me. This looks like a Wiggins circuit, and it obviously was just a bit too heavy with the climbs that were there for Tony Martin. But what was it, 26 seconds or something like that? In the end, it was a very, very and it didn't look like, although we were only half concentrating on it, that it fluctuated much.
We were watching it very closely indeed.
We were watching in the Rafa Cafe, which is an interesting experience. There was a flood of outpouring of national emotion on the final whistle.
There was a real round of applause, wasn't there? Daniel leading the applause.
It was like watching a royal wedding, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, we enjoyed it. I'm just going to say on Wiggins, somebody pointed out on Twitter that it makes Bradley Wiggins Team Sky's probably most successful rider this year. You could even say that he's kind of rescued the season. He won the Tour of California, podium Tour of Britain, and now the world title. It's not been a great season for them, but and it's an odd one because he is a real crossroads in his career. Might not, if the rumours first aired on the cycling podcast are correct, might not even be riding in Team Sky colours next year. I think he will be, but
yeah, I mean they're clearly going to hammer out this racing light deal, this kind of diet contract, where he gets enough racing to support his track program. But it'll be interesting now whether this win will kind of change the parameters of that, because my immediate thought when I saw him, tried to imagine him wearing the rainbow bands there, well, where's he going to show them off?
Well, it'd be a real shame if he doesn't get to wear the rainbow bands in a Grand Tour. And the Tour de France starts. Here we go again. It starts again with a prologue next year, doesn't it? We've got a prologue.
I think it's a time trial. It's longer than a prologue.
So it's perfect for Bradley Wiggins.
Here we go again. Let's start stoking it up there. But he does. But why not? Because why should we rule any of that out? Because we've
lots of reasons.
Well, they can no longer come up with a convincing we've got other plan B arguments, because that demonstrably failed this year. He does look in great nick, and he seems to be playing this game where he just permanently fluctuates what his targets might be. I remember this time last year I did an event with him where I put to him very directly about the hour record, for example, and he was totally dismissive of that. He said, no, that's gone, that's just, why would I? And now of course he's giving out very different signals. So we know Brad, we've all dealt with him. From one day to the next he blows hot and cold. But if he's in this kind of form, that was an extremely impressive win there. I mean, he's not given anyone a chance there.
Very impressive, and a very impressive palmarès Bradley Wiggins has, doesn't he? If you look at all the titles, he already had a time trial title on the road at the Olympics, of course, but Olympic champion, track and road, Tour de France winner. Perhaps all that's missing is a big win in a one-day road race. I don't know if Paris-Roubaix is possible for him. That's the one he fancies, but perhaps he is motivated by just ending his career with as many sort of honours on his palmarès as he can.
I can't see him winning a one-day road race like Paris-Roubaix. I just can't see it. I mean, I just don't think he's got there. He's a rider whose profile doesn't suit the kind of accelerations and the kind of moves that you have to make to do that.
In spite of what he did this year at Paris-Roubaix, I mean, I think he's a...
Well, he finished 2 places worse off than Geraint Thomas, who didn't look like he was going to win it.
He finished...
I mean, if it was...
At first concerted attempt at Paris-Roubaix, I thought it was pretty impressive. It's a race you hear, perhaps less than the Tour of Flanders, but there is quite a lengthy apprenticeship that usually has to take place before someone wins that race.
Yeah. I'd love to be proved wrong, but
I mean, the one thing that all his wins have in common, whether it be the Tour de France, the time trial on the road, Olympic track titles, they're all quite measurable, quantifiable efforts. In a road race, you've got to make decisions, you've got to make tactical decisions. I mean, I know there was a bit of annoyance in the team that when Nicky Terpstra jumped away, Wiggins didn't go with him. That was the plan. I understand Geraint Thomas might not have been too happy either, because he was well positioned, and it was Wiggins' job to go at that point or around that point. So it was a great result. He got a lot of kudos for it, but it was maybe an opportunity lost as well, not only for him but for Geraint Thomas too. Let's talk a bit about the hour record, because Jens Vogt. Well, we've got a German speaker in our midst today.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because now that he's finished, we were all decided that we're going to pronounce his name correctly. The entente cordiale of let's just call him Voigt and be done with it. Even Jens was got to the point where he'd forgotten how his own name sounded, I think.
Jens Voigt. Anyway, Jens Voigt
Bertie Voigt.
Jens Voigt set a new world hour record. No great surprise that he broke the existing mark. It was very odd. For once I found myself in full agreement with Johan Brunel, who posted on the day that it was a very odd mark that he was aiming at. Why not Tony Rominger's ride in the 90s? Yeah, so Jens Voigt, last competitive outing for him, new hour record, and he was really sort of teeing it up, wasn't he, for the the Wiggins, Cancellara, perhaps even Tony Martin.
Yeah, it felt like that, and actually, brilliant. Somebody's buffing something in the background, but perhaps they're preparing their carbon fibre bike for their assault on the next hour. No, it's been brilliantly orchestrated, actually, and it needed that, didn't it? Like in politics, you call it a stalking horse, don't you? You need someone just to go, all right, well, if you are all going to stand and look at each other from, I'll have a go. Right, now we can all get serious. So, it's obviously worked with Wiggins. I don't know what mood the other guys are in. Martin,
Wiggins has said June, hasn't he?
Right.
He's going to do it in June. He will beat that. I mean, he would have beaten that today had he just carried on for another 8 minutes or so. Although that's not allowed. I watched it, actually, amazingly. It wasn't the greatest spectacle. Eurosport got 3 million people or something watching it. Hope they tune in again for some more bike racing at some point. I was quite surprised because their record is
3 million.
Yeah, apparently, yeah. You look a bit sceptical there, Ned.
Just a little bit.
Daniel knows a lot about their record, of course, having made a successful effort himself. No, having written Eddie Merckx, the definitive Eddie Merckx biography, along with William Fotheringham's, of course. And their record was a real milestone in Merckx's career, not so much because he broke the record, but more the effect it had on him. He seemed to suffer in that record more than for any other. That's certainly how legend has it. And I did read your book, Daniel. I think pretty sure that's my recollection reading in your book. But he said it took years off his life. He couldn't sit down afterwards. He could barely walk. And famously, it does take a hell of a lot out of you, their record. I remember Chris Boardman as well, his final competitive ride as well, when he broke the athlete's hour.
You can still see on YouTube.
I thought you were going to say you can still see the lines in Boardman's face.
It's broken down into four bits, but you can still see, and I really recommend it if you've got an hour to spare.
How long do you need?
The final hour programme that documents Chris's attempt on that record is absolutely brilliant.
Really?
As a document. I don't know if you've ever seen it.
I've not seen it.
But even when even knowing the outcome at the end, it still remains tense. And actually, talking about the spectacle of the hour record, does it translate as a TV spectacle or even live in the velodrome yourself? Well, it kind of depends. But Chris's assault on the record was so close, and it was so marginal all the way through. And he dipped below the schedule, and then he hauled himself back into contention. It's really gripping, actually. And if we can anticipate anything like that in the coming few years, then that'll be terrific.
It'll get harder to beat, obviously, and it will be closer, and there will be more suspense around it. I was struck by how it seemed relatively comfortable for Jens Voigt.
Yeah, I mean, I felt quite sorry for Andrei Sosenka, the holder of the previous Merckxian record, when the mark was moved. What year was that? 2007 or 2005? No, it was 2004, in fact, because I interviewed him at the World Championships that year after he'd done it. And the mark was moved, and he beat Merckx's record on a similar kind of bike, pared down, sort of steel frame, wasn't it? And he subsequently failed a dope test for methamphetamine, I think, and he is now preparing to take on the hour record. It was preparing to take on his own hour record again. I'm not sure. I think that was prior to the rules changing this year. I'm not sure what his plans are, whether he's going to have a go at Voigt's record.
It's interesting because, I mean, Voigt didn't
twice every time he says it twice.
Voigt didn't even match Graham O'Brie's ride from 1993. Of course, O'Brie was on a bike that was then declared illegal, but he was in the ballpark of Francesco Moser in 1984. Just quite interesting. I mean, Jens Voigt is not the superlative sort of time trialist of his generation.
He doesn't really have much track pedigree either.
And he's 63.
This is the Telegraph Cycling Podcast with Richard Moore, Lionel Burney and Daniel Friebe.
and Ned Boulting. And we'll be hearing from Ned later about his new book, 101 Dalmatians.
Just something like that, yeah.
So that's something to look forward to in the final part of the podcast. Let's look ahead to Sunday's road race.
Yes.
World Road Race.
Exciting.
Championship. I mean, we've got a weekend of World Championships. I think we'll be interested also under 23 in the women's road race. And you know, there's lots of interest always in the World Championship final weekend. But the men's road race, Daniel, you've been and had a look at the circuit. It seems to be a circuit that could potentially suit lots and lots of different riders. You had an interview actually last week with John Degenkolb. Does anybody know the latest on his health?
He was in hospital for 8 days, and he has come out and he is determined to ride on Sunday, despite having no doubt lost some of the condition that he came out of the Welter with. But he, apparently was his knee, wasn't it? He's broadly okay now, and his current plan.
And he was in extremely good form, and one of the riders you would fancy for on a circuit like that, or yes or no? Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting. The bookmakers have Gerrans as the favourite, and Gerrans is the kind of rider who you would never really say is the favourite for anything, would you? I mean, he's the sort of opportunist par excellence, and it's a circuit for an opportunist, admittedly. But Gerrans has traditionally sort of done well on uphill finishes.
Simon Gerrans is the default option for when no one's got a clue.
Exactly.
No one's got a clue who's going to win the road race because the winner will win it. But in the absence of any tangible fact, the default option is Simon Gerrans. Yeah. Because it's clearly a well-designed course, because it obviously falls between enough stalls for Gerrans to be the name that springs to mind. Yeah. I think Poland are going to have a big say. They've got a 9-man team, I believe, for the first time in their history.
Well, we had an interview on the podcast you'll have heard last week, Ned, with Mikhail Kwiatkowski.
He's going like a dog, though, isn't he?
Kwiatkowski? Yeah. Well, he's going very well at Tour of Britain. Don't know if you paid any attention to Tour of Britain at all.
There's a bike race in Britain.
He's ridden in something since then and wasn't going very well, no? Am I getting this completely wrong?
Kwiatkowski will be kicking himself for not winning that race. He should have done
the Tour of Britain.
Yeah, and it was a very hard fought contest as well all week. So
yeah,
he was going properly well, wasn't he? You were there on the race.
Yeah, he was going properly well. His team,
building towards the Worlds. I mean, he thinks he's got a live chance. He was making it clear that the Tour of Britain was excellent preparation for that target.
He felt. I mean, we've talked about him a lot on the podcast this year, but no. It's fine, Ned. It's fine. You just crunch that ice again. Go on. Here we go. That's for Lionel. Lionel normally eats crisps, so a good replacement. But no, he started the season in incredible form. Remember Strade Bianchi with him and Peter Sagan got away, and he was phenomenal. He by his own admission, over-raced a little bit, and he got to Tour de France quite tired. And he rode decently at the Tour, but he wasn't anywhere near his best. He felt the Tour of Britain that he was back to the form he'd been in at the start of the year. So I think and Rafael Majka, I mean, what kind of form is he in? Is he riding?
I thought so. He's
certainly done more than anybody to earn them the 9 places on the start line, hasn't he?
What about Matteo Trentin? Is he in the team?
No. Not for Poland.
No, I know. No,
he's not been picked. No, and Italy really have two.
It's always a big talking point with Italy, isn't it?
Well, they have sort of 2 cards really. That's Nibali, who's going very well, and Sonny Colbrelli from Bardiani, who's sort of been drafted in as the replacement for Pozzato. No real match for Pozzato.
We're really lamenting the absence of Pozzato, aren't we? We could do with him at the Worlds.
You always have to lament that. Colbrelli was another rider who showed really well in the Tour of Britain as well. But my question to you, Daniel, having seen the profile out there, would he get over that last climb if it's ridden very hard? Because Nibali certainly will. I mean, why not Nibali? I mean, why not him?
Cancellara.
Yeah, there is a feeling that the race may well be decided on the descents, and certainly the last descent is 4.8 kilometres from the finish, the final climb crest. So
there could be a general regroupment.
Yes, there could be in the final. And there are a couple of roundabouts. It's pretty narrow coming in, so there's not going to be any room to organise a chase. I mean, it's the kind of finale that could suit Peter Sagan. We saw him try and go away on descents close to the finish on several occasions.
Ned's friend.
How many races has Peter Sagan
Tell us a bit about how your relationship.
I haven't got a telephone that Googles anything, so I can't tell you. But I'd love to know how many races Peter Sagan has won this year.
Not many.
Name one. I mean, I'm sure he has. It's just that none spring to mind.
E3, Harold Becker.
Harold Becker.
Not this year or last year. I can't remember.
Year.
I think it was.
Yeah, you're right.
Long time ago.
Your relationship with Peter Sagan, though, at the Tour, I watched
Funny
that
enough,
with
I've written
interest.
a bit about that in 101 Damnations, dispatches from the 101st Tour de France.
Oh, well, maybe we'll get on to that then. But I watched that with interest, your relationship.
Well, I think he's absolutely brilliant. I love him because he's just unreconstructed, isn't he? He can't spin, despite all the bling and the image and the kind of hype and the hyperbole and the excited, over-egged teenage enthusiasm of the guy. He's actually he can only be Peter Sagan. So he's, when he speaks, he just speaks from the depths of his Sarganian heart. So he's just unreconstructed essence of Sagan. And
have you ever met his dad, Lubomir? If you meet Lubomir, then everything starts to make sense.
He was at the Tour last year, wasn't he?
His brother. Do you know his brother?
Uri.
Do you know Uri?
No, not really.
He's taking him with him to Tinkoff Saxon.
Is he?
Oh, yeah.
I want to be Peter Sagan's brother.
In the Prudencio Indurain role, I think. He's apparently a model professional. His finest hour, actually, of his career. No, his finest hour of his career was when, this year at the Arctic Race of Norway, the first stage finished at the North Cape, and a Cannondale rider came over the line in second place behind Stephen Kreuzwick, and pretty much every news service said that it was Uri Sagan that finished second. But half an hour later, we found out the truth, and it was actually Davide Villela, and Uri had been in the Gruppetto, I think.
Uri would be a great subject for a feature or something, wouldn't he? Or
I'm going to get an entire book out of him. Never mind a feature.
Being Uri Sagan.
But going back to Peter Sagan, I would love to see him. I'd love to see him win the World Championships, and perhaps he will. And why not?
Was he bluffing at the Vuelta because he didn't look in good shape at the Vuelta?
No, he didn't. But then again, there weren't many stages that really suited him. There were 3 or 4 pan-flat sprinter stages where he can't contest even against Buani and Degenkolb. He's not, if you like, the second string of sprinters. He's not even quite there. Or it was a time trial on a mountaintop finish, wasn't it? The Tour de France suited him much better, didn't it?
I think he's definitely lost momentum this year. I mean, you look at the kind of rider that's now regularly beating him in sprints. Someone like Michael Matthews beat him in sprint in the Vuelta, and stages that suit Matthews, they used to be a foregone conclusion that Sagan would win them, and he would win pretty much everything where Kittel and Cavendish weren't present, and he has. I think he's gone backwards in that sense. I mean, his coach this year, Sebastian Weber at Cannondale, sort of talks a good game and says he's still as fast as ever, but it has been a poor season.
But he's also lost his tactical awarenesses. Maybe it was never really there, but he got himself in such a muddle about how to ride and race on the Tour. I remember that stage that Tony Galopin won, where that group of 5 or 6 just let Galopin go, and Sagan's going, well, who's going to take me across to him?
Riders as strong as that sometimes don't need tactical sense, do they? Because he's won
the guy down and win the race.
Yeah, he's won with brute force, brute strength, hasn't he?
And maybe he can't rely on that anymore. So that missing 5% is just introducing an element of doubt in his mind, which muddies the whole picture, which makes a winning rider not a winning rider, 5th place rider. So we talked ourselves out of thinking that Peter Sagan.
But he's a sort of opposite to Simon Gerrans, isn't he? The polar opposite. Gerrans is such a calculating, clever, smart rider.
He squeezes the best out of himself at every available opportunity, and Sagan seems to find ways of squeezing the worst.
That's what makes bike racing so fascinating, isn't it? Because we don't really know how they compare as athletes, Sagan and Gerrans. I mean, we kind of do. You just have to look at them to realise that Sagan is a phenomenon, a phenomenal physical specimen, and Gerrans is like a lot of guys. Just doesn't look particularly special, but is able to, using his head, able to win big races.
I mean, where Sagan actually perversely might have an advantage in the Worlds is that I think he's only got 2 teammates.
Is Uri one of them?
Uri, I'm sure, will be one of them.
Who's the other one?
I think it might be Lubomir. But I think one of the problems at the Tour de France was that Cannondale were almost the only team that come into the Tour pretty much advertising that they had a single goal, and it was Sagan, and everyone knew exactly the stage they were going to target. And at the Worlds, I think the focus will be on other teams, other riders. Australia are going to be extremely strong with Gerrans. So if ever there's a race where Sagan kind of could slip under the radar, maybe it is at the Worlds. But I think that finale, that descent, is where the race is going to be decided. At 4.8 kilometres from the finish.
The Spaniards.
Well, they've got, they don't have an awful lot of different options. They've got Valverde. I mean, Cancellara's made no secret of targeting the World Road Race. He's not done the time trial. He's only got 2 teammates as well, though. I think the French have got. I think, with the way the cycling's gone this year, and all the success they've had, I can see them doing very well. The question is, Galopin's won a couple of races in sort of opportunistic fashion the last couple of years, but I think he's probably a marked man now, and I don't think he could probably win big races in the way that he has won them. For instance, the stage in the Tour, there was an element of going under the radar there. It wasn't people don't necessarily automatically jump onto his wheel when he goes. I think they will now. I think Chavanel's got a great chance. You think? Well, he was poor in the time trial today. He had a bit of a rotter, but
a rotter.
He had a rotter. But he's been in fantastic form sort of this late summer, and
finally,
and he's the kind of guy who people won't necessarily be all over him if he does the kind of move that we've seen him make in the past.
Philippe Gilbert. Again, he's ridden through the Vuelta. Didn't really show an awful lot there, but I think he's in decent form.
Which Belgian did? Tom Bolen looked increasingly strong as the Vuelta went on, and he's having a late flowering, a bit of an Indian summer in his career.
Is he? Yeah, that'd be an interesting. That'd be an interesting one. I mean, Boonen. You kind of forget about Boonen. It's only last year that he was winning Paris-Roubaix, but you kind of it's quickly forgotten.
He's got a beard.
Really. And beards are all the rage, aren't they? I mean, the hit of last week's podcast was Dan Craven, Dan from NAM.
That's not a beard.
With his beard was interviewed at length by Daniel. Did you? I mean, that was towards the end of the Vuelta. The beard was pretty, as you said, unkempt by then. I mean, did you? Was he keeping it well? Was he cleaning it regularly?
I can't say he probably was, but looks at things, it was a fairly unruly thicket by that point. I didn't want to focus on it too much, I must admit.
But Dan Craven, a great hit. I think we can call him a friend of the podcast now, and we'll definitely be getting.
You gone that far?
We'll be getting Dan Craven back on quite regularly. We hope that's definitely the plan.
What about the Great Britain team? You haven't given them a mention at all.
Oh yeah, the Great Britain team.
Swifty is their protected rider.
Yeah, that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, absolutely, and he's had a good year if you take it overall, although too many second places, and perhaps his win conversion hasn't been quite what he would have wanted. But you do hope that, unlike in previous years, they've got a proper plan B and a proper plan C, and they think on their feet a bit more and have a go and just ride a bit more aggressively, because this time no one's... there's no Mark Cavendish in Copenhagen situation. There's no Chris Froome coming off the back of a Tour de France win saying, I now want to be the world champion. That they're not quite as marked, are they? They can be perhaps, hopefully, a little bit more.
Swift's in that sort of second string. Speaking of thinking on your feet, I saw some video footage this week, I don't know if you saw it, Ned, from the Tour of Britain, stage 6, where a crash happened right in front of Ben Swift, and his bike, he hit it, and he managed to leap off his bike and land on his feet. And that is on the internet.
Right.
But actually,
where did you find the internet?
Google it. That day, I was in the MTN team car for a package that we played a couple of weeks ago in the podcast, and we were right behind the bunch at that point, and I looked down and I looked up to see Ben Swift standing in the middle of the road, and I wondered what on earth had happened. Now I know. It was an amazingly nimble bit of footwork by him. Look it up.
Just last word, Rich, on the world's course. It's a bit of a theme with World Championships, isn't it? You never really know what you're going to get until the races start, and even then the under-23 race and the women's race can be a bit deceptive. They can finish in sprints. Everyone assumes that will happen in the pro race. It often doesn't. And I think there's a lot of confusion amongst the team managers, national coaches, about whether, for instance, a sprinter might be able to hang on. The French certainly think Buhani's in with an outside chance. If he's in with a chance, then I think Alexander Kristoff is almost a no-brainer. He's only got 2 teammates, though, and both of whom will probably fancy their chances of doing something themselves. So Nordhaug, perhaps less so, but also Boassenhagen.
Women's race. Who's going to win the women's race?
Well, it's either Voss or Wild, isn't it? On full.
Go out on a limb. Well, is it not a bit too hilly for Wild or Wild? The Wild, Kirsten Wild.
Wild.
Yeah.
Well, not if. I
Just
mean,
translating.
Yeah. I don't know. But if you're predicting that the men's race will stay together, I see no reason why you shouldn't assume that the women's race would as well. Although, having said that, I don't know enough about Kirsten.
It's a bit shorter as well.
The stages that she's won do have looked kind of historically to have been pan flat.
Lizzie Armitstead.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah.
Bronzini.
Giorgio Bronzini.
And friend of the podcast, Theo Geoghegan-Hart in the under-23 race.
Is he a friend? You're taking all these...
We'll be watching that.
He's the original friend of the podcast.
I think he's the original one. Yeah, the first.
He came on his gap year last year, didn't he?
Yeah. He had a really good tour of Britain, by the way.
He did, didn't he? Very impressive, yeah. Really great crash as well.
Yeah.
Another great crash.
Absolutely stunning.
That's also on the internet.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Tweet us at cycling_podcast.
So we're still in our pub in central London. It's a beautiful day outside, and we'll head back out there in a moment, I think. But Ned, tell us about your new book, the latest tome. I think this will be your third book. Is that correct?
Yeah,
well, actually fourth. Really, you did
I did a little ebook thing as well, but that doesn't really count. Yeah, no, this is a proper book. This has got enough pages to call itself a book. Just got the proofs back. It's 293 pages, and that's before I've made all the corrections to the proofs, so it might even go up.
101 Damnations. I actually didn't do that deliberately. I meant to say damnations. 101 damnations.
It's a cheap pun.
But actually, it works. It's 101st tour. It's about this year's tour. It works very well. Did you come up with the title before the race?
Yeah, but then it kind of the first week of the race.
Did you put a hex on the race?
Yeah, it might have done. But the first week of the race was all about that, wasn't it? You know, in particular... Crikey, the Cavendish crash, the Froome thing, Andy Schleck, Bach Mollema, Talansky, Contador, they all went down, didn't they? Geraint Thomas somersaulting over in front of Scarponi, or Scarponi going... You know, it was just that, wasn't it? It was an absolute mess, the first week of this race. And then it kind of stabilised into something much more solid and, if you like, unspectacular. The GC race was incredibly hard to read. I mean, I've had this debate with people recently. What did that Nibali win mean, really? Because cycling's so relative, isn't it? So hard to quantify. There's no one putting stopwatch.
What does it all mean?
What does
any of it mean?
What does any of it mean? Because cycling, you don't put stopwatches on cycling. You know, it doesn't matter that the winning time was 4 hours 21 minutes.
Some people do.
Well, they're damn fools. So you can't take anything away from Nibali's win, but I still don't know how to interpret it. So a lot of this book is asking that question. I don't really know what that talks about.
So it's not a blow-by-blow account of the tour?
No, because everyone you don't want that, especially in a race that was pretty much sewn up after a week, you know. So it's far from that. So it's in the kind of yellow jumper style. You get a little glimpse behind the frilly curtains of the television production, for sure. And even though I didn't want to, I've written again about Chris Boardman. So 3 books, 3 chapters about Chris Boardman. But, you know, he's an enduringly fascinating guy.
A little bit of...
for an incredibly boring man, he's incredibly interesting.
Is there a little bit of chin stroking in this book?
Chin stroking? Musing.
Yeah, philosophising.
Oh, there's plenty of that. And I find, you know, I'm in my mid-40s now for crying out loud. So the musing and the musing is only going up a notch. Oh, there's stuff to muse about, Richard. So make no mistake.
So
the First World War happened 100 years ago. Yeah. I muse about that enough in the book. There's plenty of musing there. And also, and I was talking to...
started calling it the Great War, yeah. I find that people get to a certain point in life where they start referring to the First World War as
I've still got the proofs that I can correct. I'm going to eradicate every reference to the Great War. But one of the... So there's a little bit of musing about this and that, and then I unearthed a couple of stories that I think in French cycling culture are quite well known, but certainly one of them isn't known at all, really, outside of France, and even there it's virtually unknown.
Intriguing.
Well, one is the reasonably well-known story of a guy called Roger Rivière, who should have gone on to win many tours and had a very bad accident. And then the rest of his life, by the way, was extremely interesting after that, because it didn't end well. And then a rider of the same generation, something like the Poulidor, Anquetil, Rivière generation, who only rode one tour and then was killed in a car accident next year, called Gérard Saint, spelt like saint. He's worth finding out about, but I'm not going to tell you any more than that.
Where would you find out about him, Ned?
Well, the funny thing is, I'll tell you the story. I'd kind of been alerted to the Rivière story because I thought, where's the race going this year? And one of the places we stopped off was Saint-Etienne, and I was kind of doing a Google fest. I kind of found out about the Rivière story because he lived there, was born there, died there. That was where his story was based. And I wanted to ask Poulidor, who is the visible presence of that generation on every race, flesh and blood, and is on the race. So I wanted to ask him for the nth time about that golden generation of French cyclists. So I started asking the question he gets asked 25 times every single day. It was, tell me about you and Anquetil then. And he kind of sighed and put down his glass and went, look, it wasn't just me and him. There were so many others. Roger Riviere and my battery ran out, the dictaphone thing that I was recording it. So I spent the next 3 weeks trying to chase down Raymond Poulidor again, say, that rider you wanted to tell me about, who was he? And eventually I found out. So the reason that it kind of works in the context of this year's race is because we had the flickering of a resurgence in French cycling. Now, whether or not it just proves to be a straw fire that blows out as quickly as it started, I don't know. But in Thibaut Pinot and what he delivered this year, I do think, for the first time in my experience of 12 years of the Tour de France, I do think there's a rider there who, unlike Romain Fayou, unlike
Romain Fayou,
but no, don't forget when he won that stage in 2009, he was going to be the next, the guy. And now, who I've completely gone out of my mind, the Europe car rider,
Tommy Roland.
Pierre Roland, not Tommy Voeckler, Pierre Roland. Yeah. He was going to be the next one. Blah blah blah. So there've been a string of kind of guys, but I do think Pinot potentially is the one. He's young enough, he's probably good enough. So now where does it go? You know him really well, don't you?
But I know his name. Because we usually get Warren Barguil and Romain Bardet mixed up, don't we?
Yeah.
I've got a clear mental picture of who Thibaut Pinot is. So I know that much about him.
I thought you spent a bit of time with Francis.
Yeah. I know his brother's his coach. Julien, I know pretty well. Is he the one? I don't know. There's a lot of difference of opinion about this in France as well. It seems to change every few weeks. The Barguil 1 minute looks like the most likely. Certainly, based on his performance in the Vuelta, various people saying that was more valuable. I think very harshly saying that 8th place in the Vuelta was more valuable than Pinot's 3rd place in the Tour. I don't really agree with that. I think they've all got great strengths and they've all got weaknesses. I think Pinot is a fantastic athlete. He's a little bit vulnerable still at times. Mentally, he got ill, for instance, before the Vuelta, which is a recurring problem that he's had, that he gets ill before big events.
Barguil, of course, we had him on the podcast last week. We had a little interview with him.
He's not a friend of the podcast.
I think you need to do more than one interview, or if you do a long interview, you might become a friend of the podcast.
Yeah, and Barguil's main weakness is that he often gets misidentified as Romain Bardet.
He looks very stylish, I think, on the bike. He rode very aggressively in the Vuelta. I was impressed with Barguil with his attacking riding in that sort of company, to ride away on a climb from Contador, Rodriguez, the rest of them.
But part of the reason I'm basing this, and this crops up in the book as well, this assessment of Pinot is he is the one that Sky have identified.
Yeah.
And I don't think they'll get him, or at least not immediately.
They've tried to get him.
But they will. I think they will, try and land this guy. It's partly a PR exercise because they want to improve their standing in France. But it's also that he's the one, and specifically not Barguil.
Barguil also, I think, is the only rider who looks good in the Giant Shimano kit.
The only rider who looks good in the Giant Shimano kit?
I think so. That's my assessment.
That's a stunning observation.
That's my assessment.
Seems to be Giant Alpes.
New sponsor for next year announced today. That's good news, isn't it? 4 years they've signed up for. They're not becoming a shampoo. Yeah, they hair.
Yeah, that's right. It's caffeine. Yeah, you get the adverts on Eurosport when you're in strange hotel rooms.
Not on the WADA list anymore, caffeine, so it's okay. No. But they've got 4 years. They're not the main sponsor. It's going to be Giant are remaining as the main sponsor. So I don't know what the deal is worth. But it's a German brand as well, which is good
and
for.
The team will be registered in Germany from 2016.
Well, Marcel Kittel, we all know about his hair. John Degenkolb, a few issues there.
Hair-wise?
Yeah, so I'll be watching with interest to see what kind of effect the shampoo has on his scalp. Anything else to add, Daniel?
On what?
You're a hair man.
On what?
Look at that Barnet.
Can I just say November the 6th?
What's November the 6th?
Publication.
Oh, the book's coming out November the 6th. Brilliant. That's the date for everybody's diary.
Yep.
You mentioned earlier that you talk about your relationship with Sagan in it. Care to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I kind of did, didn't I?
Yeah, I suppose you did.
Yeah. Rewind the podcast back to 20 minutes.
I forgot that we actually covered that. Apologies.
But I do, going back to, I'll knit the two final stories together there, Sagan and hair. And there is an extensive analysis of the hair that he presented himself with at what they now call the opening ceremony rather than the rider presentation.
That was ill-advised, wasn't it?
That was an extraordinary piece of topiary.
Topiary, yeah, it was. Speaking of which, Daniel, Daniel, anything to add? Anything you're looking forward to this weekend? What are your plans?
It's a big sporting weekend, isn't it? We've got the Ryder Cup, we've got the World Championship, we've got the North London Derby.
Right,
Sporting, Daniel, keep it to sport.
No, anything else? Had a very interesting conversation with Mark Cavendish's manager today, but I can't really reveal too much about that yet. Well, but we will do in a future podcast about his plans for next year, Omega Pharma, Quick Steps plans for next year. But Cavendish not going to Worlds, of course. And then we've got Lombardy, haven't we? Lombardy, Paris Tour. A lot of major teams have shunned Paris Tour this year, a bit disappointing.
Why is that?
I don't really know. It's a bit of a mystery to me. It's only the French teams that seem to care about it now.
Oh well. Let's leave it there, chaps. We're going to be back next week, probably with Lionel again. Lionel will be rejoining us, but we'll be podcasting weekly throughout the winter. Don't miss an episode by subscribing on iTunes. We're the Telegraph Cycling Podcast, and Ned Boulting, thank you very much. Hope you join.
One name for the Worlds.
One name for the Worlds.
Before we go on, you first.
All right, one name for the Worlds. Cancellara.
Okay, I'm going to say Chavanel.
Kwiatkowski.
There we go.
Why did I think he was going like a dog? There is a reason for this. I've seen an interview with him, or has he raced since Tour of Britain?
It's bluff.
Anyway.
Ned, hopefully you'll be able to join us again soon. Good luck with the book publication.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Rich.
The Telegraph Cycling Podcast. Subscribe on iTunes, listen on Audioboo, visit us at thecyclingpodcast.com.